Hi, Linny.
Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to episode 82 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
We like to dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the front porch.
So, Linny, we have a guest update for the episode today.
Okay.
You remember lovely Eileen Dunavant?
Yes.
And her wonderful memoir about growing up in Colorado and Missouri. She has now released I'm Little Girl, her children's book.
Oh, how lovely.
Mm-hmm. It is available on Amazon, and it is the children's book that she wrote and illustrated.
What a wonderful illustrator she is. The work that she did, we got to see through the podcast, and it is just beautiful work. So I'm really excited for her. Her career and her writing is really taking off.
It really is. So in this book, her main character, little girl, braves the world, dolly in hand. She meets person after person, creature after creature. At last, she finds what she's looking for, little boy. Once she does, you just know they will have all kinds of adventures together. So in this book, she has 19 original watercolor illustrations that combine fantasy and romance with backdrops from the aurora borealis to spider webs. The whole idea is that this book and the illustrations will fire kids' imaginations. Who do they want to meet? Where do they want to go? So Little Girl takes children on a whimsical journey to a world they'll want to revisit again and again.
And I honestly think that book could be a series. And if I was writing a children's book, I'd want her to be the illustrator because she has some beautiful skills in artistry.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that somebody takes a look at her and says, oh, what an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get her on some other projects. Or let's get a number 2 book written out about maybe this little boy and this little girl together on different adventures. So that's really exciting for her.
So great seeing that she had accomplished getting that published. And again, what an inspiration she is.
She is inspirational. I'm not going to feel guilty about the nap I just took. I don't think this lady naps. She's pretty busy.
I think so too. Well, today for this episode, we're doing something a little different. Of course, our first episode, you and I talked about Song of Achilles, but there's been so much written about the Iliads, Achilles and Patroclus, that we thought we'd highlight some of the research and commentary from scholars from around the world about that relationship, and also bring in some more information we found from the author of Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller.
Well, Nance, that sounds like a great plan.
Great. The first thing I thought we could talk about is I think it's really interesting that the author of the Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller, says the following about why she wanted to pursue writing a story about Patroclus and Achilles. She says, the central inspiration behind the book is the terrible moment in the Iliad when Achilles hears about Patroclus' death. His reaction is shocking in its intensity. The great half-god warrior who carelessly defies rules and condemns a whole army to death comes completely unglued, desperate with grief and rage. I wanted to understand what it was about Patroclus and their relationship that could create that kind of crisis. Although Homer tells us what his characters do, he doesn't tell us much of why they do it. Who was Achilles, and why did he love Patroclus so much? Writing the novel was my way of answering that question. As I've read more about the Iliad over the last month, I am really surprised at how closely Madeline Miller in the Song of Achilles aligns with the Iliad. And I like her interpretation about how it could be that Achilles' reaction to Patroclus' death is so extreme because they're in a loving relationship. It's like a missing piece of the puzzle almost in the Iliad that she fills in. I was wondering, what do you think about her attempt to come up with this reason for Achilles' extreme reaction to Patroclus' death?
I think it sounds reasonable. Now, I did not read the Iliad, so I don't know about how Homer originally made up their relationship, but it certainly was one of intensity and commitment and love for each other. I can see and understand that some relationships are intense, and I think crises and trauma can bring people close. There's a lot of war and upheaval and brokenness in their lives. At least for Patroclus, he is thrown out of his family and in desperate need of connection and feeling kind of adrift. So Achilles is almost like a life preserver for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he clings on hard. Without him, he really doesn't have very much. That's not quite healthy.
Yeah.
I can see how the author takes their relationship, and it can absolutely be a sexual one
Mm-hmm.
and a true love story. I liked that part of it. I thought that part and the relationship was kind of a beautiful part of the story. It was probably my favorite part. How did you feel about the author's taking of their relationship and making it a romantic one?
I like the idea that she created this relationship that explains this reaction in the Iliad. I think it is fun when authors take stories and they see something that could be fleshed out more completely. Sometimes we see prequels to popular novels. Sometimes we see sequels to popular novels. Sometimes we see an interesting character in the novel that someone takes and creates a whole story around. This is right in the spirit of that kind of taking a story and bringing more depth and more sense to it. So I think it is interesting that Miller was like, I don't know. I mean, Achilles, he's kind of narcissistic and egocentric, and he does defy every rule that he sees. I mean, he's just not a rule follower. You would think of him as almost kind of a loner, but Patroclus dies, and all of a sudden, the man just does lose it. And so her creation of this backstory, I think, is fun and interesting and brings depth to the story of their relationship, because Homer does not talk that much about their relationship. Patroclus is really mostly a minor character, though pivotal, but he's really a minor character. We don't know that much about Patroclus. So now we have this whole history that she has invented. And I think that that's super fun. I was really interested in learning that their relationship has been a point of inquiry since about as long as the Iliad has been around. So again, quoting Miller, she says, "The idea that Patroclus and Achilles were lovers is quite old. Many Greco-Roman authors read their relationship as a romantic one. It was a common and accepted interpretation in the ancient world. We even have a fragment from a lost tragedy of Aeschylus where Achilles speaks of his and Patroclus' frequent kisses. There is a lot of support for their relationship in the text of the Iliad itself, though Homer never makes it explicit. For me, the most compelling piece of evidence, aside from the depth of Achilles' grief, is how he grieves. Achilles refuses to burn Patroclus' body, insisting instead on keeping the corpse in his tent, where he constantly weeps and embraces it, despite the horrified reaction of those around him. That sense of physical devastation spoke deeply to me of a true and total intimacy between these two men." So I did not know enough about the Iliad to know that there was this possible gay love story in it. Had you ever heard anything about that interpretation of the Iliad?
I didn't know anything about the Iliad. But I will say this, Nancy. I love you, but I am not going to keep your corpse and lay up against it for a couple of days until it starts smelling and the flies come. I mean, I don't think there's a beautiful love story in that. I mean, that was just creepy. That is just creepy. And I love my husband, but I'm not doing that either. So to explain away, I think it indicates that it's a deep connection, but I don't know that it says that it's a romantic one. It might be codependent. Like I said, their connection is almost a little too much, I think, at times. So it's a beautiful love story and I like it, but that's creepy.
It's very all-consuming for both of them.
They have each other and that's about it.
It really is, because you mentioned, well, Patroclus doesn't really have anyone but Achilles, and that's not a very healthy relationship. Achilles doesn't really have anyone other than Patroclus in a lot of ways either.
Right. Patroclus does develop, and I said this at our first episode about this book, he does start to get relationships and develop activities outside the two of them. So you see that he is developing more of a healthy maturation of himself.
Yeah.
But the intensity of these two folks as we're the only ones is a little too extreme, I think. But with all of that said, the intensity of this relationship is then, I guess, what Miller says, like, why is it this intense? And then took it to that level.
But I have often, when I've been to funerals, thought about how difficult it is for family members to walk away from that grave. For me, that is almost one of the most difficult parts of a funeral. How do you leave your loved one there? Maybe not healthy, but I can understand hanging around the corpse and just not wanting to let that physical body go. It's an acknowledgement of the actual death. I think maybe you can believe that the person's just sleeping or something, but to actually say, yeah, they're gone, take the body, I'm walking away, that just feels like a very hard and courageous thing that everyone is faced with, but difficult.
Yeah, I think what they were doing in that book was cremation. Maybe he wasn't prepared for that. Who wants to see that? Your loved one burning up.
And they have these pyres on the beach where they're burning people.
Right.
That would be very difficult to see your loved one burned on a pyre.
I understand that. And I feel that at funerals sometimes, Nancy.
Yeah.
But when we read that book about the Native American tribe, I Am a Man, when that little baby died, little white buffalo girl, I think was her name. As the mother, I probably would not have let my baby go. Like, I probably would have jumped into the grave with that baby.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I would have been able to move on with that. I did feel that for that mother-child bond, when you have a baby, that's got to be hard. I guess that helps me to understand this a little bit more. Yeah. So we have to understand, I guess Miller is trying to understand how this relationship is between these two people and then creates this romantic relationship, which I thought was kind of beautiful in the book.
Yeah. This comment by Gregory Justainus, he is the Humanities Distinguished Professor at Ohio State University Department of Classics. He actually takes some issue with the centrality of Miller's portrayal of their identification as gay men. And in fact, that this relationship would be something frowned on by Peleus, who is Achilles' father, and Thetis, Achilles' mother. He says that at the time, Peleus and Thetis, quote, would not have been disturbed by the erotic turn of their son's friendship. Further, he says, quote, making them homosexual imposes upon them a fixed identity, like a heavy armor, an ontological essence foreign to antiquity, and one that constrains behavior. Justainus says, it would be seen as reasonable during that time period for Achilles to be in love with Patroclus, but also Briseis, and for that matter, Deidamia, the mother of his child. I thought this was very interesting. I did a little more digging. The British Museum website says of Achilles and Patroclus, in ancient Greece, it was common for men to have sexual relationships with both men and women. There were no words in ancient Greece for homosexual and heterosexual, and in classical Athens, relationships between older, often married men and younger men were a normal part of social life. So that is really a very different culture than our culture. I was thinking about how Miller really portrays this as a very monogamous relationship. And the times when it's not monogamous, there's a lot of guilt. I was wondering, would the idea of Achilles and Patroclus not having this kind of exclusive sexual relationship like Miller portrays, would that change this story for you if it was more accurate to ancient Greece times when they might have multiple relationships with both men and women?
Well, yeah, I think so. There's something about the two of them. I understand the want to be a father or a parent and having a child and having that kind of life.
Yeah.
But I like the exclusive nature of this romantic relationship. And it is dysfunctional a bit when I look at it, but it is intimate. I think it would change it if it was more fluid. Nancy, you asked me the question, but I want to ask you the question. Would you have liked the story as much if it had been a fluid sexual relationship with other people?
I think that in some ways I would have liked that equally as well if I understood that that was a more accurate representation of that cultural period, because I would have found that very interesting. That is so foreign to our 21st century American experience in so many ways. I think it would have been interesting to understand that culture a little bit more and how relationships worked.
Curious question. You wouldn't have minded that.
Mm-mm.
Books open you up to explore the inner thoughts of people in different times and places. And so I can see why that would have been interesting for you.
And for you, I can also understand you love romances. So I can understand why the centrality of a more monogamous relationship is one that you would prefer.
Yeah, I like the Hallmark Channel. I do. Besides HTV, the Hallmark Channel, as far as I'm concerned, has it going on. Okay, well, back to Patroclus. We talked about Patroclus and Achilles' relationship. Over the centuries, different cultures have dealt with their relationship in different ways. Now, this is really interesting. Other Greek writers during the period, including Aeschylus and Plato, did assume that Patroclus and Achilles were lovers. Okay. But others have argued against that, as we also discussed. Now, we're going to bring up Kristen Perkins, who is a doctoral student at Columbia University. Xenophon, a historian and student of Socrates, argued that Patroclus and Achilles were chaste friends and confidants. Later, Aristarchus of Samothrace, this was in the 200s BC, would go so far as to edit Homer's text. I didn't even know people were allowed to do that. Particularly the "we two alone," and that's in quotes, passage to rewrite chastity onto Achilles and Patroclus' relationship, and interpretation that Aristarchus viewed as both moral and historically accurate. In medieval readings of the Iliad, homoeroticism was almost universally denied through omission. In the Elizabethan era, Shakespeare's own text becomes evidence for the ambiguity of the relationship and the willingness on behalf of some interpreters to write in erotic subtext, but this interpretation was by no means universal. So that's what Perkins said. Also, in the medieval period, Achilles was seen as a cautionary tale of how not to behave. In fact, in Dante's Inferno, Achilles is found in the second circle of hell, and that's the circle of lust. Why do you think the Iliad would be considered classic?
I think the Iliad and other stories that we would refer to as classics, there's something timeless about them. And there's something about the characters that reflects the complexity of humanity. Miller says Homer tells us what his characters do, but not so much why. And I think maybe some of that ambiguity lends itself to every generation having a new look at it and maybe a new interpretation. So Miller's interpretation, it seems, is very much of our 21st century American era. Two gay men, unsure of their relationship, they get together, they're very monogamous. It seems like every generation, every culture, when they encounter these stories, it's almost like they're encountering them afresh and trying to figure out what that means to their culture.
Whew. It almost makes me want to read other books about Achilles and see how his character and his personality comes out in the other stories. But I like Miller so much, and I do like this little relationship that the two of them have, that nothing will be comparing to that, I don't think. Be like, well, Miller had it this way. It won't be the same.
Will this book inspire you to read the Iliad?
No. Because it's not written in today's language, is it?
There are modern interpretations. Emily Wilson from University of Pennsylvania released in the last couple years of well-regarded interpretation.
Well, I don't know. You have me reading a lot of books.
I do.
I'm reading our next book. So to transition. And I really like that.
I haven't started it yet.
I like it so much I was talking to Mom about it.
Excellent.
It is really a fun story. It is The Thursday Murder Club, and it's written by Richard Osman. It is just hilarious. Our parents are living in a senior community, and that's where this takes place. So it's full of fantastic characters. It's cheeky and it's fun. And yes, there's a murder.
That will be a change of pace from Achilles and Patroclus.
Yes, and it's a fun murder. It's not a gruesome horror story. This is all for fun. And we don't mind that this person was killed. There's no jumping in the grave and sadness. There are no tears in this book. It is just a lot of lighthearted fun.
I cannot wait to get started then. Well, everyone, thanks for listening. Our website is frontporchbookclub.com.
Our episodes come out twice a month on the first and third Wednesday of each month.
See you next time, Linny.
See ya.